Ye who read are still among the living, but I who write shall have long since gone my way into the region of shadows. Greetings, Poe fans. Welcome back to our Poecast, and I am Carmen Bolden.
And I am Jeannie Smith.
And we are the Poetastic
Two.
I kind of rushed that, Jeannie.
I was wondering. Where are you running off to?
I know. Okay, we're going to get started, and we have a very special guest with us, Dr. Jeff Thompson. And Jeff, we brought you here for the Poecast because we want to hear about your love and knowledge of Dark Shadows and also some of the Poe elements and in Dark Shadows, as well as Dan Curtis. And you've done a lot of research and writing projects in your books about all of these things. And we're so excited to have you here and hear about all these things. So let's go ahead and get started with just if you want to do a little short introduction and then kind of go right into just basically how you got hooked or, became interested in Dark Shadows.
Okay, thank you, Carmen and Jeannie. I'm thrilled to be here with you and to talk with all of your listeners on the podcast. I'm Jeff Thompson. I live here in Nashville, and for 35 years, I taught English at Tennessee State University here in town until I retired a little bit early recently. And concurrent with most of that time, I was the weekend announcer at WAMB, which was Nashville's big band easy listening radio station.
Oh, very cool.
So I was involved with popular culture, sharing it with my students and playing great music on the radio and writing. I've written for fanzines, magazines, websites, and chapters for multi-author books and introductions to the Hermes Press reprints of the Gold Key Dark Shadows comic books. And then I have written 3 complete books about producer-director Dan Curtis, who created Dark Shadows, produced The Night Stalker, and directed Trilogy of Terror, The Winds of War, Burnt Offerings. Here's one of them, The Television Horrors of Dan Curtis.
Yes.
And you're holding another one, House of Dan Curtis, a play on the name of the movie House of Dark Shadows. And after I wrote that book, a fan friend of mine said, well, now that you've written House of Dan Curtis, you have to write Night of Dan Curtis to match the other Dark Shadows movie, Night of Dark Shadows. So I wrote Nights, plural, of Dan Curtis, all about his most epic productions, his 2 World War II miniseries, his 3-hour Western movie, his adaptation of Dracula, written by Richard Matheson and starring Jack Palance, and Curtis's UFO miniseries Intruders, They Are Among Us. I did not start watching Dark Shadows on the very first day, June 27th, 1966. Like many fans did not. That's why it was such a low-rated TV show for the first several months. But 10 months into the Gothic serial that ran on ABC Monday through Friday from 1966 to 1971, Dan Curtis, who had been told by ABC that the show was going to be canceled, added a vampire character, which had never been done before on daytime TV. The vampire Barnabas Collins, an ancestor of the present-day Collins family, and he was released from a chained coffin and began a reign of terror in Collinsport, Maine. But because he was so beloved by the viewers, he soon showed a more remorseful, vulnerable side, and Dan Curtis realized that Barnabas Collins couldn't simply be a one-dimensional monster of the month or something on the show, that he had to become, a more sympathetic protagonist of the show. I watched Dark Shadows between the ages of 8 and 12, and one day in September of 1967, I was homesick from school, and I was flipping through the channels and came across Dark Shadows. I didn't know what it was, but from the very first scene, I was hooked, because the first scene I saw was of David Collins, a boy my age, having a nightmare. And in his dream, he and Sarah, a girl my age, were in the basement of the old house, the place where Barnabas Collins lived. And they were in the cellar and amid the cobwebs, and they saw a coffin in the middle of the room. And then the coffin lid opened, and out came the vampire Barnabas Collins brandishing his wolf's head cane. So obviously I was hooked from that moment on, and watched every single day from then on, and collected all of the Dark Shadows memorabilia, the books, comic books, trading cards, games, puzzles, everything. And even after Dark Shadows was canceled, I continued reading the Gold Key comic books and the Dark Shadows Gothic novels, paperback novels by Dan Ross, who wrote under the pseudonym of Marilyn Ross. And later I became friends with him and his wife, Marilyn.
Oh, cool.
And then as a teenager, I began writing for Dark Shadows fanzines, including Kathy Resch's fanzine, The World of Dark Shadows. So it's been a lifelong love affair with Dark Shadows, and studying all of Dan Curtis's 4 productions. I was always excited to see in the TV Guide in the 70s and 80s and later, whenever Dan Curtis returned with a movie that he had directed, sometimes with Richard Matheson writing the script or William F. Nolan writing the script. So and in all 3 of my books, I cover all 4 of Curtis's productions, but I specialize in certain ones in the different books. In the television horrors of Dan Curtis, I focus on his horror productions, his 2 Night Stalker movies, and his adaptations of Dracula, Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Turn of the Screw, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and others. And in the book you have, House of Dan Curtis, I look at his mysteries and crime dramas. He did 2 movies about the Bureau of Investigation agent Melvin Purvis, and did quite a few late-night ABC Wide World mysteries, some of which involved the Dark Shadows actors, whom he continued to use in future productions. And then, as I said a moment ago, Nights of Dan Curtis is about his epic miniseries and Dracula and The Last Ride of the Dalton Gang, the Western, and so on.
All right. Thank you for sharing all of that. It's fascinating. It really is. And one of the things that Jeannie and I were talking about is, before watching Dark Shadows, were you interested in like Gothic literature or anything like that? Or was Dark Shadows what really was the kind of hook for you?
Well, I, of course, had already started reading comic books, and so I was familiar with the supernatural and sci-fi and horror, and I had read classics illustrated, including the Frankenstein issue and so on. So yes, I believe that and before Dark Shadows, I loved the Munsters and the Addams Family. So yes, I was familiar with classic horror before then, but Dark Shadows really cemented my interest in Gothic horror, vampires, witches, werewolves, time travel, especially.
Oh, yes.
And background music in films. I became a film music collector, and I've written some liner notes for some soundtracks, because Robert Cobert's music for Dark Shadows is so distinctive. It's like another character, like the music for Batman or Downton Abbey or other TV shows in which the music plays an integral part. And Robert Cobert scored almost all of Dan Curtis's productions. So when you saw Dan Curtis's name and heard Robert Cobert's music, you knew that you were in for a treat. So Dark Shadows began my interest in all of those things: time travel, music, costumes, acting, writing, everything.
Oh, that's awesome. I was going to say, my husband walked through one day while I was watching an episode of Dark Shadows, and that, pivotal music when something's happened and it's leading the mystery of what's going to happen next. And he asked me, he said, is, with that being the mid 60s when that happened, was that kind of the origin of that style of music to indicate, and I said, I don't know, it's something I'd have to look up, but I thought that, because it's, to me, Cobert's music is fantastic. It's
Oh,
beautiful.
it is, yes. Well, I think those musical stingers had existed in movies. Max Steiner in King Kong and others
Hmm.
had done it, but you're right, it probably became a staple of TV and especially soap operas with
Hmm.
Robert Cobert doing it. And the Dark Shadows music was unusual in that it was a small orchestra. It was not
Hmm.
just one organ or an organ and a piano, the way the other soap operas were from the 50s, many of them
Hmm.
up until the early 70s. So Robert Cobert, with his music for Dark Shadows and later The Doctors, added
Hmm.
orchestral, full, lush music to the soap opera, and I think that added to it.
I agree. It to me it adds so much more depth to the production. Absolutely. Um, Jeannie, I was going to say, Jeannie, jump in anytime. I know we were having a discussion about the Munsters and Adams family before you jumped on, and we were kind of talking with Dark Shadows starting in 66 and Munsters and Adams family both only having 2 years for their um, show at the same time from 64 to 66. It's like, did Dan Curtis, with him almost getting canceled until he added Barnabas, it's like it was almost a continuation a little bit, in a more of a dramatic way, not a comedic way. Do you think that played into his development of adding Barnabas?
Very possibly. You're right that the Dark Shadows is like the other side of the coin of the
Mhm.
Munsters. It's the dramatic side of a
Yeah.
family of supernatural creatures, and
Mhm.
it's also a supernatural upstairs downstairs sort
Yeah.
of story. But yes, Dan Curtis was a big fan of the Universal monster movies, and one of his favorite movies was The Innocents, Jack
Okay.
Clayton's version of The Turn of the Screw. And
Okay.
Curtis later had a turn of the screw type possession story on Dark Shadows two times, and then
Mhm.
he filmed his own version of the turn of the screw, and even found the actress who had played the housekeeper in that 1961 Innocence movie,
Mhm.
and put her in his movie. So he liked the Universal monster movies, and I think that helped him. Probably the Munsters was in the back of his mind, and then um,
Mhm.
as the show was nearing cancellation, he had already used some ghosts and some mysterious elements and a phoenix fire creature, a woman who burns and rises from her ashes.
Mhm.
But when the show was on the verge of cancellation, his three daughters, who were about my age and the age of most of us little kids who were watching,
Mhm.
told him, make it scarier. So
Mhm.
he thought to himself, well, what scares me the most? A vampire. So I'll add a vampire. And
Okay.
Curtis's and the writer's original plan for Barnabas was that he would just be the next monster on the show and would last maybe 3 months, and he'd bite people and cause havoc, and then one of the good characters would drive a stake through his heart, and then that would
Right.
be it. But Shakespearean actor Jonathan Frid brought such depth and
Mhm.
pathos and emotion to the role that uh, Jonathan used to tell the story when after I'd been on for a few weeks. Dan Curtis brought me some letters, and I thought to myself, "Oh no, this is my pink slip." But no, it was fan letters. And then the next week, Jonathan received even more, and then he started receiving bags of letters and boxes of letters, and
Wow.
even had to ask some of the New York area fans, the viewers,
Mhm.
to meet him on some Saturday mornings to help answer the mail. So Jonathan Frid had suddenly had become a heartthrob and a matinee idol in the afternoon, something that he never dreamed or really wanted, but
Yeah.
was always very flattered and grateful to the fans for their devotion.
Mhm. Absolutely. He did. I mean, the again, I started watching it right before, Willie opens the coffin and everything, and he appears. And the couple episodes right before that, they were good. It was interesting learning about the family, and I'm anxious to go back to the original, start. But he added so much, and his acting skills, style, just his character, like you said, the depth is a great word. It had me mesmerized to using a Poe Poe link there. And I think, Jeannie, didn't you have I think we were talking about, didn't you have a question about like having that supernatural element on daytime TV?
Yes, that's what I was going to ask him, is about how Dan Curtis managed to throw out the genre of certain elements from the supernatural world into a modern daytime soap opera. How did he figure out that that would actually be acceptable? Because the Munsters and the Addams Family they were like a prime time. So
Yes.
why would the soap opera angle always threw me, is how did he, pitch this idea and it became to fruition to be played on daytime television, and especially after he introduced the vampire. How did it continue to be accepted? Because if you look at all the other soap operas of that time frame and everything, they didn't match. It was like there was no commonality between Dark Shadows and the big three that I always remember of, like, uh, Guiding Light, As the World Turns, General Hospital, those kinds of shows. So, did you ever find out how Dan Curtis even came up with the idea of wanting it to be daytime television rather than prime time, and how it was taken to keep that on with a supernatural aspect of it?
Dan Curtis wanted to pitch Dark Shadows as a nighttime show. That's what he intended when he had the meeting with the ABC executives. In mid 1965, Curtis had a vivid dream, like so many works of art, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and songs and paintings and everything. It came to him in a dream. He had a vivid dream and saw a young woman riding on a train along the ocean and going to a forbidding, mysterious old house. And she goes up to the door and she hears wolves howling, and she knocks on the door. And then that was all that he dreamed. But
Wow.
he took that idea to ABC and wanted to do a nighttime show. And the executive said, "Well, Dan, isn't that just Jane Eyre?" And he said, "Well, is anybody doing it right now? If not, let's do it." But somehow the executives decided, I guess, to shore up the daytime schedule, because ABC really didn't have much going on in the daytime yet, except for General Hospital and Let's Make a Deal. And I think maybe The Dating Game and The Newlywed Game had begun or were starting around that time. Mm-hmm. So they decided to put it on in the daytime. And so Curtis worked with Art Wallace, who later wrote some Star Trek episodes and things like that, to work on the actual story projection and the characters. So that's why Art Wallace is credited throughout the run of the show, even though he didn't stay longer than the first 3 months or so. Mm-hmm. But the original point of Dark Shadows was just to be a mysterious Gothic romance serial, just a couple of steps beyond The Edge of Night or The Secret Storm. Not necessarily supernatural, but mysterious, like the Gothic novels that were very popular in the 60s, written by Dan Ross, Marilyn Ross, as well as Phyllis A. Whitney and Dorothy Daniels and others. And it was a good idea. And I think you will really like those early episodes, because they had a lot of atmosphere at local color. Mm-hmm. And then every once in a while you hear, ghostly sobbing in the halls of Collinwood, and There's a locked room mystery and much talk of ghosts and three ghosts who haunt a cliff at the estate. But unfortunately, it was not receiving top-notch ratings. It was a good idea, and those early episodes are very interesting. But even back then, I guess the networks wanted more instant results, and so ABC said we're going to cancel it. So then Dan Curtis added the vampire, and once he added that, then he added another ghost and just went full force with the idea of the supernatural. And then, of course, after Jonathan Frid's Barnabas had become such a well-loved, almost sympathetic character, Curtis said, well, what can we do now? Okay, well, let's show how he became a vampire. And so the show, no daytime show had done this, went back in time. Victoria Winters, the young woman on the train in the first episode, participates in a seance, and suddenly she is thrust backward into time into the year 1795, when Barnabas is still a young mortal man. But in one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest story ever told on Dark Shadows, we learn how and why Barnabas becomes a vampire. And it's a heavy, emotional Shakespearean drama. It's just fantastic.
It is. It is.
And then when that ends and the show comes back to the present, which is now the year 1968, then you'll see that Curtis and the writers start using ideas from Frankenstein and The Turn of the Screw and many ideas all from Edgar Allan Poe, The Cask of Amontillado. In the 1795 storyline, Barnabas bricks up one of his adversaries. And then later, in the course of the show, Barnabas himself is bricked up 2 times.
Oh, wow.
And The Telltale Heart in the 1897 story, the storyline when Dark Shadows had its highest ratings, Quentin Collins hears the heartbeat of his dead grandmother. And also in that storyline, there's a Pit and the Pendulum moment when one of Quentin's enemies ties him to a table with a swinging blade coming closer and closer, and the premature burial. There's a story in which Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, played by the Hollywood movie star Joan Bennett, experiences that, and later in the series, Quentin is buried alive 2 times. And even little touches, like in 1897, there is a very strict, sparse schoolhouse called Worthington Hall, run by a stern headmaster, a martinet, kind of like the character in William Wilson, when the boy is at the school and he's miserable. And many other Poe touches, all of the lighted candles and the literal shadows and the paintings. The paintings on the show are very, very important. The paintings of Barnabas, the portrait of Josette, portrait of Quentin, which causes him to become a Dorian Gray type character. The painting keeps him young. So the writers and Curtis, all of whom worked together closely, Curtis was involved in the writing, borrowed elements from many stories and myths. There's a great Orpheus and Eurydice moment when 2 characters go down into the underworld. So, but even though some people say the writers were ripping off or copying everything, and true enough, they did lift ideas from all of the classics that everyone has read or has heard about or seen movies about. But the way they handled it made them original and fresh again. The way they combined the elements and presented them in a new way made it original. And for many of the viewers, especially the little kids who may not have read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde or Frankenstein or Dracula or Poe or Hawthorne, it was new to them. But then somebody probably said, oh, that's like that Poe story, or that's like that movie. Yeah. And that's how the viewers, we fans, broadened our horizons because we went back to the primary sources after having seen
Absolutely.
it on Dark Shadows or in comic books or in movies.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree because while I've been watching it, yeah, little nuggets of different stories will come back to me, and I'm just like, oh, that's like this or that's like that, and it's exciting, because it makes you have fond memories of when you read those stories originally. And like you said, new viewers can get hooked on different things, kind of like a network, a network of gothic horror.
Right.
Absolutely. Do you think that Dan Curtis was like, do you think he was a Poe fan, or do you think he had, I know like with the Universal Monsters, he really liked that. Do you think he had favorite authors? Did he ever say, because he did such a variety of the different horror films of Dorian Gray and such.
I'm not sure that's a good question. I know he loved The Turn of the Screw and the movie The
Mhm.
Innocents,
Yeah.
uh, but I'm not sure about what other novels he may and stories he may have liked. I know his longtime secretary would go with her husband on trips to Europe and would go through bookstores in Europe and bring back all sorts of books for him to read.
Oh,
And
neat.
so I'm sure some of them were Poe and Hawthorne and
Mhm.
Daphne du Maurier and others, but also books about legends, myths, ghost stories, uh, you know, supernatural witchcraft, things like that. But
Okay.
I'm not sure about what some of his favorite writers
Okay.
were.
Yeah, and we weren't sure if you would know that or not. We were just like talking about all the different elements that we were going to discuss today, and that came up, and it's like I wonder if Jeff does know this. It's just, it's fascinating to, see, what directors and producers and things and writers like what their favorites are and what really motivates them to do what they do. Um and let's see. I was trying to think, Jeannie, what else we were going to ask Jeff? A couple of other things. Can you think of what was something else you were going to ask?
Well, I was going to talk about how, of course we're on the daytime and this is not nighttime, but the genre aspect of it, uh, I mean, was it actually, it stayed on for 5 years, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong,
Yes.
Jeff. It was 5 years. And you said that within 10 months of the first publication or showing, they were going to cancel it. So I'm curious to think, would it have lasted longer than 5 years? Because if you think about the soap operas today, they still are on the air. They are still going strong and having those arcs and everything. So, what was the defining point of Dark Shadows finally losing its momentum, I guess? Is my curiosity. Did it have anything to do with the time frame, the genre, or the total just like segue in the television industry to where it wasn't as popular anymore? Because, the Addams Family was only 2 years, Monsters was only 2 years, then you got the Dark Shadows that was only five. So was it that the genre was losing focus, that a lot of people were losing their wants for the horror, the supernatural, that kind of thing? What kind of thoughts do you have about would it have been able to sustain as much as the other soap operas in the end? I guess is what I'm saying.
Yes, you're right that 5 years for a soap opera is a very, very short time. When As the World Turns, Guiding Light, Days of Our Lives, and others have run for decades. But I think the fact that it was a supernatural series eventually limited it.
Hmm.
And by the end of the show, the writers were starting to repeat themselves. There had been two Turn of the Screw type possession storylines and things like that. And I think some of the actors were beginning to tire of the the regimen. As Nancy Barrett, who played Carolyn Stoddard, said, the show was perhaps too ambitious. And it is amazing to see everything they did with the now rudimentary base special effects and things like that. But really through the costumes and the sets, and of course the great acting and the special effects, really made it real. It was truly a universe that they created, but it was a lot of hard work. And toward the end, Jonathan Frid was losing interest in playing Barnabas. He didn't want to become typecast like George Reeves as Superman had. And that's why for the last 3 months of the show, he was not playing Barnabas. The show went into parallel time for the second time during the run of the show. And Jonathan Frid was playing Bramwell Collins, who was the son of the now dead Barnabas Collins in that world of 1841 parallel time. Okay. And even Dan Curtis himself admitted that he was losing interest in the show. He wanted to go on and work in films. And of course, and talk about ambitious, the cast filmed House of Dark Shadows while they were doing the TV show. Some of it was during the 1970 parallel time storyline. So Barnabas, Julia, Maggie, and others are missing for a while because they're up in Tarrytown, New York at the Lyndhurst estate filming House of Dark Shadows. So half the cast was up there making the movie, and the other half, led by David Selby and Laura Parker, who were not in the movie, were holding the show together. And then immediately after they taped the final episode of Dark Shadows, they went back up to Lyndhurst and filmed Night of Dark Shadows. And then in that same year, I guess, Dan Curtis and his wife and 3 daughters made the move from New York to Los Angeles. And then he began producing The Night Stalker. He didn't direct it. Jean Llewellyn Moxie, a Horror Hotel, and others directed it. But then Curtis decided, well, I'm producing these shows, but why not? I'll cut out the middleman. The director, I'll just start directing more of them myself, because the director of Dark Shadows, one of them, Leela Swift, one of the first female directors in the golden age of television. She started in the 50s. Leela Swift directed over 800 of the 1,225 episodes. And she more or less took Dan Curtis under her wing and taught him how to direct. He directed a few of the late 1795 story episodes, and then later directed some in the 1897. And so she really taught him how to direct. And then some of his influences in directing, one of them was Sam Peckinpah. He said that he saw The Wild Bunch and was shocked and fascinated by the violence, and that is perhaps why House of Dark Shadows is much more violent than anything you see on the TV show. So I think it was just, the show had just run its course. You can continue to think up more everyday storylines for a soap opera, and they reuse stories over and over too. But I guess there's only so many times you can go back in time, or drive a stake through a vampire's heart, or see a werewolf, or this, that, and the other. So the writers were becoming exhausted too, and I think some of the actors and Curtis. So, and the ratings had gone down. In the summer of 1969, 20 million people were watching Dark Shadows, and that's phenomenal to think, because in today's TV, a show like NCIS or The Big Bang Theory or the Super Bowl will get millions of viewers, but probably not 20 million. And yet that's how many people were watching back in the days when there were 3 networks. But after the 1897 storyline, The next storyline was one based on H.P. Lovecraft, actually,
Okay.
which was very different, very unusual, very strange, and some of the fans did not like the way the show was going, and the ratings began to drop off, which was unfortunate because after that came the 1970 Parallel Time storyline, which is one of my favorites, based on elements from Poe's Ligeia and from Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. And then the next trip back into time was very good too. But by then, fewer and fewer people were watching. But even when the show ended, 12 million people were watching it, which would be, the
That's
number one
yeah.
TV show today.
Right.
That's amazing. And I guess there's something to be said for quality over quantity. I know just growing up as a child and teen, I'd watch soap operas with my mom and stuff, especially during the summer. And they soap operas do generally, rerun or reuse different story arcs and things like that. And so that kind of makes sense why he wanted to move on to something else, and everybody was kind of at the same time feeling that way.
Right.